Chapter 2, Miss Victoria. Baroness. What are you talking about, my lord? Lazen asked, puzzled and surprised. It's just Mrs. Lazen, in this reality, she's not Baroness, it's just Mrs. Lazen, Connor said aloud, standing behind Lazen. Lord Melbourne noticed that Lazen did not seem to have heard Connor, despite the volume of his voice she must have heard. Lazen noticed that Lord Melbourne seemed to see something behind her, so she turned her head to look, but seeing nothing, she saw Lord Melbourne even more confused her. Hey! Mrs. Lazen! How are you? Lord Melbourne rectified, attempting to conceal his confusion as the girl continued to pull his trousers to draw his attention, but he did not take his eyes off the face of the former governess of Victoria, and her right hand in the direction of the household affairs of the palace. Fine. I suppose, Lazen replied even more disconcerted, as if he had asked what color the moon was. Lizzie wanted to see you to show him the drawing of the one she spoke to at lunch. She told me you wanted to see him, Lazen added, trying to get the conversation back to more normal terrain. Lizzie? Said in a tone of question Lord Melbourne. It's the little girl, she's your niece, Connor said aloud, and again Lazen did not flinch, as if she had not heard. Lord Melbourne looked down to see the beautiful little girl. Oh, sure, yeah, I wanted to see your drawing. Lizzie, Lord Melbourne told the little girl. The little girl was blonde and had beautiful green eyes, with beautiful pink cheeks and very white skin. She was more or less thin, and she looked very smiling. Look, Uncle William, this is you, these are your crows and this is me, here is Mrs. Lazen. Lord Melbourne was crouched next to the girl, his hand tentatively resting on her back. Lord Melbourne listened to her in a trance, and he could not help but feel himself touched, remembering his own child when he was little, except for being a special child needed more care and understanding than the rest of the children. He noticed that Lazen saw the child with a tender smile and sweet gesture, something that he did not usually see in the cold and controlled Baroness, well, at least the one he knew. However, he could not help wondering, if she did see of same way to Victoria when she was a little girl in her charge. But then he saw Connor approaching and waving a hand in front of Lazen's face. Lord Melbourne saw that the woman did not react, as if the hand that had just passed inches from her face was invisible. Then he saw Connor's face, which with a wide mocking smile confirmed that it had been a way of showing him once again that the rest of the people did not see him, as if he were indeed invisible. Here, Lazen does not work at the palace. She's the housekeeper at Brocket Hall, Connor told her. Lord Melbourne's mouth dropped open, but when Lazen noticed the look on his face again, he ducked his head and almost hit his nose in the girl's drawing, concentrating on what she was saying. It's really a very nice drawing, my charm. Lord Melbourne said tenderly to the girl, how old are you? He saw again the bewilderment in the face of Lazen, and even the astonishment in the face of the little girl. I mean, you remind to old fool of your uncle how old you are, he added with a smile. You're a fool, uncle. You know I'm 7 years old and I'm 8 in 2 months. Lizzie replied with a childlike laugh. Lizzie, you're 8 years old in 3 months, not 2. Thank goodness that soon your new governess will arrive so that you apply more in the studies. Lazen gently rebuked her. I'm sure you'll be very diligent in the studios, treasure. Lord Melbourne said to the little girl affectionately, and felt as if he really wanted the girl, as if he had known her for a long time and not for just a few moments. That is to be seen, my lord. You already know that Lizzie has a great talent for drawing and playing, but to study does not excite her very much. Now if you excuse me my lord, I must take Lizzie to bathe and change her, said Lazen. Of course bar. Mrs. Lazen, replied Lord Melbourne, who was quite uncomfortable in this new situation, for he was accustomed to treat Lazen with great respect and distance, and even he felt a little intimidated by her, who always cared for Victoria like a very jealous chaperone. Lazen said goodbye with deference, but with suspicious eyes, as if she knew that something very strange happened to her employer. The little girl said goodbye to Lord Melbourne, and after they left the library, Lord Melbourne went to Connor to ask him to explain the situation. "I think it would be wise that you will drink a brandy, to better assimilate the information," Connor said condescendingly. Lord Melbourne poured himself a brandy with trembling hands, out of anxiety at what he was about to hear. "You see, Lord Melbourne," Connor said, sitting down in an armchair and crossing his legs, while Lord Melbourne did the same in his favourite armchair in front of him, "where do I start? There are things you remember about your life at this time, which remain the same in this reality. Unfortunately the situation your wife and son is same, both are dead at this time." Saying this, Connor saw with compassion to Lord Melbourne, whose face reflected a resigned sadness, "But other things have changed. In this life your brother Frederick married a few years ago and had a beautiful daughter, you just met, Elizabeth Lamb, better known in the family as Lizzie. That's the good news. The bad news is that almost 3 years ago, when your niece was about 5 years old, your brother and sister-in-law died in a fire at their house." "Is my brother dead?" Lord Melbourne asked in pain. "I'm sorry, Lord Melbourne, honestly," Connor replied with genuine pity, "but that's what has an alternative life. It gives you some things you did not have in another life, but it takes away others from you. In any case, the girl is orphaned of parents, but by the will of your brother you are her legal guardian, and that is why the little girl has lived with you for almost 3 years. In practice it is as if you were her father." Lord Melbourne took a gulp of brandy, and his face revealed an inner storm of mixed feelings. "But there is more, Lord Melbourne," continued Connor. "In your other reality, you would be the Prime Minister at this time, but here, you are no longer Prime Minister." "I'm not?" asked Lord Melbourne, bewildered. "No, in this life, after you were dismissed by the King William, putting an end to your first government, you decided to withdraw from active politics and you resigned the leadership of the Whig Party. That is why King William could not re-entrust you with the formation of the government a few months later, as in your reality," Connor replied, referring to the abrupt end of Lord Melbourne's first term as Prime Minister after only 4 months, when he was dismissed by King William IV. "But then, I was not Victoria's Prime Minister? Or maybe, in this world Victoria is not the Queen?" Lord Melbourne asked anxiously. "The Queen of Great Britain is called Victoria, yes, that's the same," Connor answered earnestly. "I see, then Victoria does not know me," Lord Melbourne said sadly. "I'm afraid that's right, the Queen does not know you," replied Connor expressionless. "Maybe it's better this way, that way we cannot hurt ourselves, or rather, I cannot hurt myself again being close to what I love and cannot have," Lord Melbourne said, with an ironic smile, without conviction in the voice, and with a great sadness barely contained. Connor saw him again with compassion. "So the little girl, my niece, is the compensation of heaven to my pain? To have the opportunity to be a father again, to have the love of daughter of that girl, is it my reward?" Lord Melbourne asked between sadness and illusion. "Yes, we can say it is," Connor replied with a friendly and compassionate smile. Lord Melbourne smiled, and then his face covered with a certain joy, showing a small hope. "Well, it's not a bad reward, maybe that little girl is my chance to redeem myself and find some love in my life, and maybe for once in my life a relationship with someone I love has a happy ending," said Lord Melbourne a little more excited, with damp eyes. "I'm glad that attitude, Lord Melbourne. I think you're on the right track. How about I'll update you on the details about your new niece and adopted daughter?" Connor said with a smiling face. Lord Melbourne smiled cheerfully, and they both began a lively conversation that lasted for more than 2 hours. Connor told him many funny and tender anecdotes about the little girl, that Lord Melbourne was supposed to know, many because he had lived them first person in that alternative reality. Lord Melbourne seemed more and more enthusiastic about the idea of being the adoptive father of that wonderful little girl, whom he felt he already wanted. The conversation continued until a knock on the door of the library announced the presence of someone. "Lord Melbourne, I am Lazen, may I speak to you or be busy, my lord?" said the familiar voice of Lazen through the door. I think you must attend to this matter without loss of time, Connor said with an enigmatic smile and gesture. Another surprise, Mr. Connor? Asked Lord Melbourne, amused and nervous. It's all possible, Connor replied with a gesture of mischief. Can you hear me, my lord? I will come later? Asked Lazen. Do not. You can pass bar. Mrs. Lazen, Lord Melbourne replied, suppressing a laugh, as he saw the mocking gesture on the face of his new friend Connor, as he stood and adjusted the suit he was wearing to receive Lazen in a posture worthy. Slowly Lazen opened the door and entered the library, but she did not go alone. She was accompanied by a woman who was considerably more short of stature, thin and very young, practically until yesterday a teenager. She was a pretty, sweet-looking girl, with a face of little girl, and long hair in a bun, covered by a nice lady's hat. When Lord Melbourne saw her, his heart fluttered and his face paled, he even felt his legs failing, and he had to put a hand on the back of the armchair to make sure he did not fall. The girl was Victoria. Your Majesty. But what are you? Said Lord Melbourne in a voice of broken emotion, moving forward toward the women, feeling the desire to embrace Victoria, but knowing that he could only kiss her hand. Wait, William. Let them talk, wait, Connor said quietly, putting a hand on his shoulder. Lord Melbourne stopped short, the emotion reflected in his face, as the two women stared at him in astonishment. Lazen shook her head to one side and the other, bewildered, as Victoria reflected a great surprise, her eyes wide open, and open-mouthed. Your Majesty? What are you talking about, my lord? Lazen asked as she looked at him worriedly, as if she were seeing a loved one who was losing his sanity. You remembered something about the Queen, you had a bad night, Connor advised. I suddenly remember something about the Queen, about the crown. I apologize, I have not had a good night, Lord Melbourne replied, embarrassed and touched, unable to take his eyes off of the beautiful face of Victoria, who she blushed and looked down uncomfortably at his intense gaze. When has he had a good night since I'm at his service, Lazen thought with some irony, but still she was still worried about her employer. Feeling good, my lord? Do you want us to come back later? Lazen asked worriedly. Do not! Exclaimed Lord Melbourne, distressed at the thought of Victoria leaving, but before the eyes of the women he strove to calm himself. No, it is not necessary. This is the right time to talk. Tell me, Mrs. Lazen, he added, running his hand through his hair and adjusting his clothes elegantly. Well, my lord. She is Miss Victoria Edwards, Lazen said, and seeing the surprise on Lord Melbourne's face, she understood that she had to remind him or clarify him, the new governess of Miss Elizabeth. Well, if my lord approves of it. Do you remember that we spoke, my lord? Miss Edwards is coming to meet you, to get your approval, Lazen added as if she were trying to explain something to a young child. It's a pleasure, Lord Melbourne, I'm at your service, Victoria said courteously, but at the same time shyly, bowing. I'm delighted to meet you, Miss Edwards, said Lord Melbourne, still uncomfortable and astonished, but regaining control over himself as he extended his hand to Victoria. Victoria, timid and clumsy, extended her hand, confused by that deference to a girl of lower social rank, and then Lord Melbourne took it delicately, and in so doing he felt like an electric current inside himself. He felt the intense emotion of touching her again, of feeling her hand again in his. Kindly Lord Melbourne bent his head and pressed his lips to Victoria's hand, and sweetly laid a kiss on the back of Victoria's hand, covered by a cloth glove. Then he slowly raised his head, nailing into the eyes of Victoria the deep gaze of his big hazel eyes, making her blush, her red cheeks like a tomato, and her face showed surprise and emotion. Victoria's heart raced, throbbing like a runaway horse, and a slight tremor ran through her body. And for a minute it seemed that they were only two in that room. Lazen stared at both, disconcerted. My lord? Lazen asked. Oh, excuse me, Mrs. Lazen, said Lord Melbourne, returning to reality and releasing Victoria's hand slowly, realizing that he had held her more than he should have, though she did not seem to have noticed either. "Please, sit down, lady, miss," he added gallantly as he stepped back and indicated the chairs next to his armchair. "Thank you, my lord." "Miss Edwards." "Miss Edwards." Lazen had to exclaim when Victoria, still entranced by the gesture and look of Lord Melbourne, she had stuck to the ground, like fool. "Excuse me, Mrs. Lazen, my lord," said Victoria, embarrassed, as she proceeded with Lazen to sit down while Lord Melbourne did the same in front of them. "So Miss Victoria, you're going to be Lizzie's new governess," Lord Melbourne said, not believing that this was happening, thinking it was a dream he could wake up at any moment, but he did not really want to wake up, while he could not stop looking at Victoria, who smiled ashamed. "As you remembered, my lord, Miss Edwards came to us on the recommendation of Lady Emma Portman, who meets one of the ladies who sponsor Miss Edwards's school. She presented good credentials, despite her young age. The letters I showed you, the letters from the school where she studied, attest to her good education, her culture, and her talent for teaching. In the institution where she grew up she was the most outstanding student of her class, had excellent qualifications in almost all subjects, later emphasized like teacher in the same institution of girls of inferior courses. And, besides, she has a good command of the label, the protocol, she has impeccable moral conduct, she is quite religious and she works very well with young children," said Mrs. Lazen. "I understand, forgive my bad memory, but as I said before I had a bad night and now I'm a bit clumsy, silly." "What institution is that where Miss Edwards studied and grew up?" asked Lord Melbourne with interest and innocence. "The Lowood Institution, a school for poor and orphaned girls, Lord Melbourne," Victoria replied gently, but in a firm voice, as if she meant that she did not feel ashamed of a situation that a less strong person would be ashamed to admit. Lord Melbourne was even more astonished, thinking that this definitely could not be real. The Queen of England turned into a poor or orphan girl in a strange parallel life. "I see, and in that institution, did you teach girls the age of my niece?" asked Lord Melbourne with kindness, and a charming gesture on his face. "Yes, and smaller girls, and also larger. I really loved doing it, my lord. It's my vocation," Victoria answered with genuine happiness, and a charming smile. "And you dominate all the subjects that mentioned their credentials?" Lazen interjected to ask. "Yes, Mrs. Lazen, I like geography, history, literature, grammar, mathematics, calligraphy, and religion," Victoria answered enthusiastically and sympathetically. "You really are very studious and applied," said Lord Melbourne with genuine admiration, and something more. "Thank you, my lord," Victoria replied, flattered, but at the same time pleasantly nervous for the intense look of Lord Melbourne's little puppy. "And in languages, Miss Edwards?" asked Lazen, who felt somewhat excluded by the exchange of looks between her employer and the young woman. "I speak French perfectly, and I can teach it very well, also a basic German, and a little Spanish," Victoria replied. "Dan sind siemit meiner Sprach vertraut, then you are familiar with my language," Lazen told him in German. "Ganz gut, es scheint mir ein sehr reich und interessante Sprach," quite well, it seems to me a very rich and interesting language, answered Victoria also in German, with a friendly smile. "Satisfied, Mrs. Lazen?" asked Lord Melbourne. "A lot, my lord," answered Lazen. "Miss Victoria, may I call her that?" "I prefer it to Miss Edwards, I think, is more cordial and close," said Lord Melbourne. "Yes, of course, Lord Melbourne," she said, blushing again. "Forgive my curiosity, but you name yourself as, like the Queen. Does it have something to do or is it just a coincidence?" asked Lord Melbourne. "Oh, that. Yes, Lord Melbourne, I was born a month after our Queen was born, and my mother, hearing that a new princess had been born to the royal family named Victoria, insisted on giving me that name. Victoria replied, a little amused. I'm glad, it's a beautiful name, Lord Melbourne replied, making her blush again. And tell me, Miss Victoria, to you, what does this job mean? Honestly, it means all, my lord. I honestly am a young woman without resources and without family, but I have my knowledge, my education, which is not despicable. I want to make my way in life with my education. I want to live decently thanks to my own effort. I want to feel useful and worthy, my lord, Victoria answered in a firm, kind and sincere voice, with pride. I think few people your age or any age could have said it better, Lord Melbourne said, trying to contain his own emotion. Miss Victoria, the job is yours, if you want, of course, he added. Of course, my lord. Thank you very much. Victoria responded excitedly. My lord, Miss Victoria brought all her things, so she's going to be installed in the servants' quarters, today, Lazen said. Here at Brocket Hall? Asked Lord Melbourne, surprised again. Of course, is there a problem? Asked Lazen in surprise. None. I think it's great, said Lord Melbourne, and seeing Lazen's surprise and Victoria's embarrassed smile again, moderated his childlike enthusiasm. I mean, of course, Lizzie will have her governess nearby, at all times, he justified, unconvincingly. You will see that she is a lovely girl, he added, addressing Victoria. I am anxious to meet her, my lord. Victoria replied sincerely. Come with me, Miss Victoria, I'll introduce you, Lazen said. Both women said goodbye and asked permission to withdraw, and Lord Melbourne said goodbye as a nervous and anxious child. When they left the library, with Victoria's image still fresh in the retinas of his eyes, Lord Melbourne gesticulated nervously in a corner, not quite knowing whether to laugh or cry. Then he felt someone watching him, and when he looked up he found Connor sitting in an armchair with a wide grin, and only then did he realize that he had not seen Connor for most of his interview with Lazen and Victoria. So that later you do not say that I do not do anything for you! Exclaimed Connor in a jocular and mocking tone.